So we will get started, and then as people join, they can join. So good evening, everyone. My name is Diana. I will have the I'll have the camera off for most of the session, but I just wanted to say hi, meet everyone. So welcome to the session. Today we're talking about Columbia MBA Round 2 admissions. I graduated from Columbia in 2021, and since then I've been working in consulting and then now in corporate strategy. And give me a second to pull up our presentation. So the way this is going to go is feel free as we go through the session to ask any questions you have. You can use the raise hand, and then feel free to unmute yourself to ask. And then we'll also have some time at the end of the session for questions. Sorry, was that a raised hand?
Okay. Sorry, I was just trying to do the thumbs up.
Oh, okay, cool. Great. This is my first session on this platform, so please bear with me. Are you all able to see the presentation?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so Columbia Round 2 applications. The deadline's coming up pretty soon. So what we are going to talk about first things first, the deadline. Secondly, we're going to talk a little bit about the GMAT, the GRE, and the executive assessment, which is another test that they accept. And then we're going to speak about crafting strong resumes and essays. And then we're going to talk about how to make sure you are prepping your recommenders the best you can, and then we will get into interview prep and then Q&A. As I said, feel free to raise your hand and then unmute yourself as we go if you have questions. Okay, so round 2 deadline. So I'm sure all of you know, because we're pretty close to the deadlines, that Columbia has, I guess there's 3 sorts of modes that you could enter the full-time MBA. So traditional, they call it a 2-year MBA. It's really 20 months, which is so August 2025. You would graduate in mid 2027, and that's I guess that's the entry we're focused on now. So the round 2 deadlines are coming up January 7th, so pretty soon. That's about a month from now. And then there is the January 2025 entry. So they usually refer to this as the J term. It is also a full-time program. The only difference between the August and the January program and the January entry program is that you do not have a summer internship for the January one, and so it's a shorter time. You start in January and then graduate. In 16 months. And then there is the deferred enrollment, which I don't think that we're addressing that much here. I mean, the application process is pretty much the same, but it's more, so this is more targeted towards college seniors and current grad school students who are applying for admissions to basically start at a later date. Any, I guess, questions on deadlines or entries before we carry on? Great. Okay, so the first thing, the GMAT, the GRE, the executive assessment. So I am guessing most of you by now would have taken it. And I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Is there anyone on the call who's applying this round who hasn't taken it yet? And you can just show by raising your hand. Jordan. Okay, is just out of interest, is that because you plan to apply? Okay, you're retaking. Okay, got it. Okay, you're retaking next week. Okay, got it. Cool. Okay, awesome. So that is actually something that I wanted to address. Let me get back to the presentation. Okay, so GMAT, GRE, executive assessment. So people always ask what's preferable, the GMAT, the GRE, or the executive assessment. I just say take whichever one you want to take. You can do your research as to, I think they all essentially test the same thing. So they test your verbal reasoning and your quantitative reasoning skills. Just take basically whichever one you want to take. I have shown here what the class averages look like, and what percentiles those averages represent. So for the GMAT, for example, the class average for Columbia's last class was 732, and that represents 99th percentile. So basically, your top 1% of test takers get the score. And if you look at the the GRE, the verbal, and the quantitative, it's also a pretty high percentile. Now, for the executive assessment, they do not share what the average is of the people who took the executive assessment, and that's probably because not a lot of folks applying to Columbia's full-time program are taking the executive assessment. Like I said, you can take it. I've known people who took it and did get in. It just depends on what you want to do. The one thing that I would say is, and folks always ask this question, how much does your score matter? Your score isn't everything. It isn't everything, but it does matter. So for those retaking, I think that's a good idea. So when an admissions officer is looking at your story, right, they're looking at the entire thing. So they're looking at what your experience is. They're looking at what your recommenders are saying. They're definitely looking at your GPA, looking at your GMAT/GRE, and looking at like whatever professional qualifications you have. Now, in general, you do want to get the highest score you can take, right? And now this depends on your financial situation, depends on how much time you have. I would highly recommend trying to get the highest score possible, right? Now, if you've taken it a few times and it's just not working out, but you feel like you can kind of supplement that with a high undergraduate GPA, or perhaps you took the CFA or CPA, or some other professional certification, then that works. But the reason you want to try to get your score and I guess your stats looking as high as possible is, one, it expands the options of schools that you can attend. Now, obviously, we're talking about Columbia's MBA here, but there's a lot of great schools, right? You do want to put your best foot forward and have like the best options you want to have. And the reason you want to do that as well is the more, I guess, like the more schools you're admitted to or the more options you have, that also actually increases your opportunities for funding or for merit scholarships. When you look at merit scholarships for schools, the merit scholarships are it's very opaque, the process, how they do it. And you just want to make sure there's some stuff you can control and some stuff you cannot control, right? Now, if you're 5 years post 5 years in your career, I don't think you can control what has happened in your career, but you can try to control your score. So just basically try to get it as high as possible is what I'm going to say. The other reason it matters is that it stands out in job applications. So in general, when you apply, Columbia has a non-grade disclosure policy. So that means an employer cannot force you to disclose your grades, the grades you got in the MBA. But it can be attractive to employers if you had a higher GMAT, and this often is like mostly, I think, investment banks, private equity funds, they kind of care a lot about this. So all I'm saying is it opens up doors for you. The next thing, we're not going to talk a lot about the actual test or test strategies, but figure out how you learn, figure out what worked for you when you were in undergrad and studying. Try to replicate that method of studying for this. And if you need a tutor and you can't afford it, definitely get one. And before we move on to the next thing, I will pause there. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question on this. Okay. The next thing we want to talk is resumes. So in general, you want your resume to be 1 to 2 pages. A lot of the general advice is that if you have less than 10 years of work experience, 1 page should be fine. I suppose if you've done a lot of research or you're closer to that sort of 10 years of experience or more, 2 pages could be fine, but generally one works. The next thing you want to focus on with your resume is it isn't just about describing your, I've seen, I guess, like a lot of folks tend to just basically copy paste their job descriptions and put that. So it's less about that. It's more about putting the details of your impact. And so your job responsibility is as a credit officer, but what does that actually mean? What were you actually doing? And some of the ways you can quantify your impact is it's pretty hard. And let's be real. I mean, especially, I guess, like a lot of folks on this call are early in your career. It's pretty hard sometimes to know, depending on the job you have, what exactly your impact was, right? So you could estimate, so basically I delivered XYZ project and the revenue uplift was $20 million, making this up, right? You could estimate what the cost savings was. You could estimate, this wouldn't be an estimate, right? But you could talk about, well, you managed X number of people on a certain high impact initiative. You maybe developed a workshop or a leadership offsite for, 50 participants. So to the extent that you can quantify. One point I will say about the quantifying, I think it's become sort of popular for folks to do this in the recent years. Make sure you're quantifying something that makes sense. Something else that's very popular right now is using ChatGPT. So you want to be careful about using ChatGPT. Now, I think ChatGPT is good for sort of giving you general direction and advice on what you want your bullets to look like. But it is also now increasingly common to spot something that's been written by ChatGPT. And you want to try to blend, I guess, like using AI and using your own voice and actually describing what you actually did. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard this, but it is pretty easy to tell if someone has written their resume with ChatGPT. It tends to have very long words. The sentences tend to say, they kind of tend to say a lot of things without saying much. So just be careful in how you use that. General formatting, spell check. This should be an easy one. Just make sure you're always checking, revising. Get someone else to revise your resume for you as well if you need to. The next thing for templates. So I would recommend Berkeley's MBA resume template. So if you just Google search Berkeley Haas MBA resume template, you'll find their template. It's pretty simple. I actually downloaded that one, and that's the one that I use for all my applications. I've also shared it with a lot of people that I've coached who've used that. It's a pretty strong template, and you can actually even use it for recruiting outside of applying for MBAs. Any questions on resumes?
Sorry, I had to put something in the chat, but are you moving slides by chance? I think it's still on the GRE slide. Or
Oh, is it? Give me 1 second. Do you see my PowerPoint now?
Yes, now I do.
Okay, sorry. I did not realize I was doing that. You know what? I might. Okay. Sorry, I am. Okay. So the thing is, I cannot see the presentation and also see your questions at the same time. So I'm gonna move away from the presentation if that's okay with everyone, and then just focus on like seeing you all and seeing the questions in the chat. My apologies again. It's my first time hosting a session on Leland. Okay, so let me go through the questions. Is the executive assessment less favored by CBS? How would it affect the application review? So the executive assessment is fine. I would just say do whatever test you're comfortable with doing where you can get the best score possible. It isn't like if you get an amazing executive assessment score, they'll say, oh, well, this is bad that this person didn't take the GMAT. So I would say just take whatever makes sense for you. Is the GMAT score on there for the focus edition? I am not sure what that means. Maybe you can unmute yourself and ask that.
Yeah, sure. So all the MBA schools that take the GMAT recently switched to the newer edition of the GMAT, which is called the GMAT Focus, and it's scored differently also. So I wasn't sure if the score you had on there, it looks like it's the older GMAT version, but I wasn't sure.
Yes, I'm still referring to the older version of the GMAT.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
In general, you just want to try to get, try your best, but try to at least get, I would say at least shoot for the 90th percentile onwards, whatever the new scoring is.
Okay, thank you.
And then different slides. Yes. Okay, cool. All right. Okay, I'm going to move away from the slides. They're actually not super helpful in this case. I think someone had a question about resumes, or was that about these slides? Okay, so let's move on to essays. So there is a bunch of questions. Columbia seems to have a bit more questions than other schools this year. So the first parts, and these are not essays, these are just two 50 character short answer questions. What is your immediate post-MBA professional goal? I think that's pretty straightforward. When you're answering that question, I would encourage you to be honest about what exactly it is. I have seen a tendency of folks trying to write something that sounds like what admissions wants to hear. Now, the thing is, you're doing that and all the other thousands of applicants are doing it. So write what is your actual immediate post-MBA professional goal. Now, if your immediate post-MBA professional goal is something that's a significant career switch, I would try to sort of, and you can address this somewhere else, make the case in some of the other, like, because you have your resume, you have the other essays, you have the additional information, try to make the case about why you feel like you can make that switch, right? So a pretty simple one is, let's say you come from media and advertising, and your media post-MBA goal is to work in private equity. Now, you can work in private equity. It might seem like a stretch if you're saying, well, I want to go work in private equity in the deal team, but you can go work in private equity in the value creation team and focus on media, advertising, marketing strategies for portfolio companies. So that's pretty reasonable. Or you can say, well, I'm going to do investment banking for the first 2-3 years, whatever it is, and then move on to private equity. So just make sure, one, your answer is real, not what you think they want to hear, and two, that you've made the case and you've actually thought about how you can make that jump. And then the next short answer question is, how do you plan to spend the summer after the first year of the MBA? If it's an internship, please include target industries and/or functions. If you plan to work on your own venture, please indicate a focus of business. Now, this is very straightforward. Like pretty much the same principles as the prior short answer question. And if you are not sure what you want to do for internships, a very easy thing to do is, I think a lot of times folks going to the MBA and they're not sure what the options are besides the traditional banking consulting. And unfortunately, I did a very traditional consulting option. You can, so look at the school's employment report and see where people landed jobs, what people did, what their roles were. Or you can go on LinkedIn and look at either like the current Columbia MBA class or alum. You can filter for schools and just like browse through and see where folks are going in terms of internships. That could, one, help you craft a reasonable, attainable answer, and two, help you also figure out, because I know the MBA is also very exploratory for folks, figure out what some ideas of where you could land an internship. Any questions on the short answer questions? Okay.
So one of the questions is about the Phillips pathway, and I know that that's changed over the last few years a little bit. But I'm curious if you have any advice on ways that you've successfully seen people kind of address like why they're interested or how they want to best utilize that particular program.
Yeah. Is everyone familiar with the essay she's referring to? If not, I will just pull it back up on the screen so you can see the question while we're talking about it. Give me 1 second. Okay. Do you see the essay questions now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a new question, and this also was not a question at the time that I was in school. And actually, the background behind this was there was a renowned professor who passed during the time I was in the MBA. I think it happened in 2019, Kathy Phillips, and this is what this program was named after. So now, tips on this. The first thing is, it sounds pretty simplistic, but read the question, right? And I think when we talk about, when we're talking about bias, when we talk about inclusion, systemic inequality, all of these things, I think we all kind of generally have an idea of what it is. I think if you live in the US, it is pretty obvious what's being spoken about here. I would encourage folks who are maybe not so familiar with the US, or maybe have been, I guess, like spent their last few years elsewhere, to actually, it sounds very simple, just like Google what all of these expressions mean, right? Because you want to make sure that you are addressing the question. And now the good thing is that you only need to pick one of these 5 skills, right? So mitigating bias and prejudice, managing intercultural dialogue, addressing systemic inequity, understanding identity and perspective taking, creating an inclusive environment. And then alternatively, you can share an example of how you made a team more collaborative or fostered a greater sense of community. Now, one advice I would give around this question is when you're talking about inclusion, it's basically dealing like how have you dealt with people who are different from you or from a group where a lot of people are very different from each other. You don't always need to think about it from the perspective of a from the perspective of a race lens, right, or a gender lens, or sexual orientation lens, or I guess like what we know is like these traditional ones. If you genuinely have not had that experience, you can think about things like how you have maybe managed working with clients or with counterparts who are in a different country, right, or folks who are from another function, not the same as yours, right? So there's also a lot you could say about cross-functional collaboration here, right? So let's say you were in the analytics consulting team, but you had to work with the marketing folks and with the legal folks, and all of you automatically are super different. It is a super diverse group. You're all thinking about the problem in a different way, and you can think about how you facilitated that dialogue, or how you created how you basically made everyone's voice feel heard in that situation. So definitely there's a lot of I think all of us can think of some ways where we have done these. Any more, I guess, any other questions on this essay?
Super helpful. Thank you.
One thing actually that I would say, yes.
I know it says like think about a time where you had to use one or more skills. Do you have a recommendation for like how many skills to go into? Because like if we try to do a lot of them, then it might just be a little bit scattered in terms of how the essay is. So do you have a recommendation for how to approach that?
Your question is how many of the skills to speak about? Is that the question?
Kind of, yeah, like just how to approach how many to talk about. Yes.
So I would talk about one. It's only 250 words. Perhaps it depends on your situation, right? So, and which actually brings us to the next topic of creating essays. I would do a data dump. So basically leading up to whenever you're going to write this essay, I would do a data dump of any experiences you've had professionally where you had to deal with topics like this, right? And the way I would do my data dump that I found helpful was, and of course preparing for the MBA like many months in advance, is it would just like be a note in my phone, like in the notes app, and just think about, oh, there was a time I did this, or the time this thing happened related to this topic. And then at the time you're now ready to write, you've sort of like cleared your mind and spent a lot of time brainstorming. And then now you can say, well, actually, a lot of these themes seem to be around managing intercultural dialogue. So I'm going to write about that. Or maybe a lot of these themes are about mitigating bias and prejudice. So I'll write about that. Or maybe a lot of these themes are about, one or two of these skills. So I would pick, based on like your actual real experiences that happened to you, that's how I would pick the skill to write about.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Essays. So I guess before I go into general essay guidance, is there any other essay that anyone has questions on? So they have 3 essays plus the optional one. So just in the interest of time, we won't address all of them. You can feel free to unmute yourself if there's one that you want us to address. Okay. All right. General essay guidance. Okay. So the first thing that you want to be super clear on is why you want an MBA. The second thing is why you want an MBA now. Why now? Why not 2 years ago? Why not next year? And then you want to be super clear on, as you write your essays, what is your post-MBA career goal, the short-term and the long-term one, and your why behind it, right? And I think a lot of you are familiar with the why, having prepared for, many other MBA applications. So your why, as in, I'm making this up, but perhaps I really want to go into venture capital because I really care about the systemic inequity when it comes to capital allocation for female-led businesses, et cetera. So that's why I really care about this. And therefore that feeds into maybe my first role. I want to go into corporate development, and then long term, I want to join a major venture capital fund, or I want to start my own. But the why behind, like, it just being a job is, so the why differentiates between it being just a job and a career or a mission. So you want to know that for yourself, and then you also want to know why Columbia specifically. Now, especially in round 2. They are going to care a lot about why Columbia specifically. Now, I mean, I'm going to be straight up. There's a lot of schools. There's a lot of great schools. Columbia is a great school. There's a lot of other great schools where you can meet the same goals. But in round 2, you need to be very crystal clear on why Columbia specifically, which brings me to this question in the chat from Isabel. Given this is a chat about Columbia, is there anything you'd recommend emphasizing across any of these essays for Columbia specifically? I would want to stay away from giving like specific advice on things you want to put in the essay. When you think about Columbia, there's a few ways you can think about it, right? So one big thing people think about is location. Okay, New York, everyone loves to be in New York. It's so great, all of that. You can think about the why and see why that ties into what you are trying to do, right? So for example, and don't use this answer because I'm sure a lot of people use it, and this is true for you. If your dream is to be an MD at an investment bank, I mean, there's no better place to do it than here, right? In NYC, that is. Now, there's other things about Columbia besides the location. You could reference the location. It is important. It's important for networking opportunities. It's important because it's the hub for many industries. It's important because it's very it's a very diverse, multicultural, very much like an international experience that you would have in your career in New York. But everyone says that. I would say really go into the website, go and look at all the classes. It sounds very simplistic, but look at all the classes. Don't just like read the titles. Go read who are the professors. Some of those professors are renowned. Some of those professors have a digital footprint outside of what's on the website, and you can easily just search them. You can look them up on YouTube. You can see some of the like fireside chats or presentations, et cetera, that they've done, and just really like that can help you really understand why you are motivated by taking classes with this person, by being mentored by this person. So really, it's very simplistic, but really like actually do your research on Columbia to be able to answer this, like the why Columbia. Now, a lot of people also tend to reach out to alum or maybe attend sessions like this to try to get the why, which that's fine. I would encourage reaching out to alum, to the extent that you're able to reach out to them. But always come to those conversations very prepared, very, very knowledgeable. I would rather you come to that conversation as an alum. There's always like a bunch of people like trying to speak about Columbia. I'd rather you come to the conversation where it's like you've done your research and maybe you have these key questions. You're like, well, I read about this professor. What is your experience taking that class? Or I read about this class. How popular is this class? Like, what do you think about this thing? Or I see that, 35% of people, making this up, went into investment banking, especially the bulge brackets. How do you think about the bulge brackets versus the boutiques, and do you think Columbia is better for the bulges or the boutiques, etc.? So just be very specific and targeted, and that will also show admissions that you're being thoughtful. And we will continue with the essays. So I just mentioned why. So going back to the conversation, I just mentioned what things you need to be clear on. When you're crafting compelling essays, a few key points. So the first thing is make the effort. Now, it sounds very, very simple, but a lot of people get dinged because they they write an essay based on like, well, I just have like an hour left and it's like, is a deadline. And hey, I have like a great GMAT score, I have a great GPA, I have great brands on my resume. So whatever essay I write, they'll take me. That isn't necessarily the case. And actually, I have seen it time and time again. Even when you do get into the program, I would highly encourage you to make the effort in written communication. So like we mentioned, your essay has to be thought out. You actually have to answer the question, etc. Actually have to have done your research. When you get into the school, you'll see there's a lot of opportunities where you can apply for either, it could be like scholarships, funding, it could be some fellowships, it could be like specific classes or programs that are high in demand, or there was this like different like fundings that you can get from the school for entrepreneurship, etc. And I was sort of behind the scenes working with the school in making some of these decisions. And 100% of the time, the people that like win a fellowship or win something or get into something, they actually made the effort to write something compelling, versus other people who are just like, oh, I'm just going to write like 3 sentences because my background speaks for itself or my name speaks for itself. That is not the case with MBA admissions. The next thing I mentioned is understand the question. Very simplistic. And I would say this is as a sidebar. So after Columbia, I joined McKinsey, and there's on the website, people always ask, oh, how do you prepare for consulting? On the website, they're very clear on the characteristics they're looking for. Now, it seems, at the time, it seems kind of fluffy. And if you read, I guess, what these MBA programs are looking for, it kind of seems kind of fluffy. But if you actually like read who they are asking for, what they're asking for, and it's simple, but like Google like the description of who they want, then it's going to make it so much easier for you to be able to tailor your application to actually meet those requirements and have a compelling application. And then in terms of as you write your essay, so first thing is I would do an idea dump. So as you just go about your day, depending how much time you have left, maybe you only have 2 hours left to write this, just for your different essays, just have an idea dump of just like anything related to the topic that you think might be interesting to address that has happened in your past, anything you're curious about, anything you want to explore in your essay. And then when it comes to the actual writing, you want to have a structure that is very important, because people need to be able to follow your essay, and people need to be able to look for what they're looking for very quickly and get it from your essay. Now, this is also, I guess, like basics of writing an essay, but the way you would structure it, and it depends what you're answering, right? Make sure it's logical. This might even be somewhat of like an analytical exercise. You're like, well, I have like these 7 things I want to address in this essay. Paragraph 1 addresses this, paragraph 2, 3, this, and make sure you at least have those bullet points in there. And then after that, go in and form a story and basically like form sentences that bring the whole essay together, so that when somebody reads it, it makes sense. And then the other thing about the essays, as I mentioned, and I'm going to keep emphasizing this, answer the actual question you're being asked. The next thing, don't waste real estate. So when you are, this kind of goes back to my point of Google, what exactly they're looking for. When you are, so now you are, okay, I'm applying for Columbia MBA and I'm clear on what they're looking for. I would literally write down, okay, so Columbia MBA is looking for all these 20 characteristics, right? Whatever you've taken away from, and this is also, I'm also not going over it because it would be pretty clear on the website. I would literally write out the things they're looking for, write out underneath those the bullet points of the things about you and your career and your academic experience and your outside your career, your extracurricular experience that addresses all these things. And by the time you've written all your essays and your resume, and even your optional essay, I would go and like check off all those sub bullet points to make sure I have answered, I have presented myself in a compelling way. I've addressed every single thing that they're looking for, so that there could be no gaps. And to this point as well, when you're writing your essays, don't waste real estate writing things that are not additive to your story or your narrative, or just don't get your point across. Now, of course, it's an essay, right? So it should be easy to read. It should be lovely to read. And they could be things like descriptors and anecdotes and stories, etc. But to the best extent possible, make sure you're being very targeted at what you're trying to say. Pretty simple next pointer is the basics. So get your formatting right, your grammar, your spell check. So that's pretty simple in this digital age. There should be no reason anybody ever submits a poorly formatted essay or an essay that hasn't had the spell check. And then the last thing you want to check for when you're done with your essays is this your voice? To my point earlier, are you trying to set yourself, present yourself as what you think is the ideal candidate, or are you presenting yourself as who you are, but highlighting the things about you that make you the ideal candidate? You want to make sure you're doing the latter. And that's why it's always good to have a friend or someone read over for you, to make sure that you sound authentic in the essays. I will pause there. Any questions about the essays? Okay, I think someone seems to be making food. I can hear a microwave. If you don't mind muting yourself. Great. So the next
Sorry,
thing
Diana, I had a
Yes.
question about
Mhm.
the essays. I think it's kind of minor, but with the word limits, do you think that's always a hard cap? So if you were to say put 251 or 255 words, do they look at that as you not following instructions, or would they kind of give you some leeway?
So I don't think it's a hard cap. I suppose if it's within if it's 250 and if you do 260, I don't think that's a big deal. Now, if you write 300, that is a big deal. It's less about you not following instructions. It's more like they've thought through this and they're pretty sure this can be answered in 250 words. And I would try as much as possible to be as concise as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Quick question. How much do the essay questions change from year to year? So significantly, because these are not the questions when I applied. So the question about your professional path, your career goals over the next 3 to 5 years, long-term dream job, that question's always been there. The Phillips pathway question is new. The question about Columbia being a collaborative learning environment, there was some other version of this question, not quite. So they do change a little bit. Now, I don't know if the reason the questions change is because, you know, there are some things that changed in the US over the past few years, and maybe now the questions will stay the same, or if this is something they plan to keep doing. Any questions? Any more questions on the essays before we move on to the last topic, which is the recommendations? The last two topics, recommendations and interview prep. Question: do you work with deferred MBA applicants? I do work with deferred MBA applicants. The principles are still the same. I think the thing with the deferred MBA applicant is that you are, of course, you're coming from a different lens, right? So probably most of your experience is academic versus professional, but there are ways to address what they're looking for with purely, I guess, primarily academic experience. So yes. And I will share at the end of this call a link to my my coaching page. Okay, managing the recommendation process. Now this is super important. So for Columbia specifically, first-time applicants, they're looking for one recommender, and this has changed. In the past, you needed more. And for reapplicants, you need one additional recommender. Now, they recommend a current supervisor, a former supervisor, or someone who's senior to you, but maybe not necessarily supervising you. If your current supervisor, I guess this happens in a lot of cases, but if you cannot get a recommendation from your current supervisor because maybe you don't want them to know you're going for an MBA or it's kind of sensitive, then there is space there in the application for you to address that. Now, for the recommenders, two key things. So one is you want to give them advance notice and reminders. And I always say, make it easy for people to give you what you need from them. And you know you're applying for an MBA and you know 6 months out or a year out, whenever you're applying, I would prep them as soon as possible. Now, let them know the deadline. Maybe have like check-ins with them once a month or every 2 weeks or whatever the case is. But make sure you keep reminding them, because at the end of the day, it's your application. You care most about your application. And people aren't tracking the deadlines as much as you are. So just be very careful the way you manage that. The second thing is remind them of your impact. Now, the recommendation questions, and these are the same recommendations questions at Columbia, at all the schools, is basically how the candidate's performance, potential background, qualities compared to those of other well-qualified individuals in those roles, provide examples, and also what is the most important piece of constructive feedback you gave the applicant and what was the applicant's response. Now, when I say remind them of your impact, so you cannot draft a recommendation for your recommender. And by the way, with writing styles, it's pretty easy to see when applicant has written for themselves as well. But you do need to share these specific and remind them of these specific examples and the things you've done. So now if somebody's been working with you for 3-4 years, they don't remember everything you did. They're probably managing a bunch of other people. And when you prep them, it could be helpful to either have calls with them. Maybe you have this actually like in writing for them, bullet points of the characteristics you've shown that answer the question that they're being asked. And like, of course, don't write it for them, right? But let them have those examples to call on. Just make it very simple for them to write. And I would also share these examples well in advance so that the people who are writing the recommendations can take their time, be able to write it thoughtfully, really think through it. Any questions on the recommendation process? I recognize we are running out of time. Okay. The last thing I'll address is the interview prep. So the interviews mostly tend to be with alumni. It's a very simple interview. And Columbia cares a lot about community, cares a lot about belonging, cares a lot about basically, do I want to hang out with this person? So the interviews in themselves are not complex. I think the main thing is you want to try as much as you can to create rapport with your interviewer, right? And just know the answers to basic things like why the MBA? Why do you want to do it now? Why CBS? What's your short-term, your long-term goals? Be very clear about what's in your resume in case they have a question about that. But the main thing is they're looking for somebody that they think would be a fit for the school, and just a fit socially as well, right? Because I'll say like most of the MBA is about that. Okay, so any more questions? I know we're out of time. I can go over a little bit, but of course feel free to drop at 8 p.m. if you need to go. When do interviews take place in round 2 once you know if you are selected? I actually am not sure of that, but I am sure that is on the website. Interviews are also
Yes, so
yeah.
I wanted to ask because it says when they announce it, but I was wondering, okay, do they take place the next week? Do they take place in person? That kind of,
Oh,
like
you
how many
mean
weeks more or less? I know it's in February.
oh, as in the advance notice you have? So you'll generally have at least a week. The way they work is you can do them virtually. And I've also interviewed applicants as an alum. You can do them virtually, or you can do them in person. It just depends who they match you with and what the schedules look like.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
because they let you know the decisions are released by February 20th. It says on the website, but it doesn't. I wasn't sure if it's like, okay, you have 2 more weeks to decide when to take it, and if you choose that kind of nature.
Yeah, generally you'll have at least a week's notice, and of course you can schedule and reschedule. I would say don't reschedule it too many times. That looks bad.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Yep. Okay. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you have any questions. I will just go back to sharing the PowerPoint here. For 1 second. Oh. Okay, so this is a link to my profile. If you need help with applications, so you could do, we could do an hour. I think I have 3-hour and 5-hour packages on my profile, and the application prep is pretty customized. So I don't do the whole, I guess, like prep you from beginning to finish. It's more like what you think is important and what parts you feel like you're struggling with or where you really need to focus on, because the timelines are tight. So feel free to visit my profile, book sessions. I think you can also book a 15-minute intro call to figure out if basically we're the right fit to work together in the first place. Okay. If there are no more questions, which, sorry, I need to take this down to be able to see the chat if there are any questions. Oops. Okay, great. There is one more question in the chat. Okay, that's a thanks. Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope this was helpful. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions on my profile. I've just shared the QR code there. I will pop the link again in the chat. And thank you, and good luck with your applications. Cheers, everyone.